Welcome to the session, Creating a Livable Neighbourhood That's Accessible to All. I'm Elaine Hills, one of the councillors for Hanover and Elm Grove, and I'll be the host this evening. I'd like to thank the four excellent speakers who have taken time out to come and speak to us today. They'll be looking at accessibility within the context of livable neighbourhoods from slightly different perspectives. First, we'll have Brenda Peuch. She's an inclusive design consultant who's working on an equality impact assessment for low traffic neighbourhoods in London. So low traffic neighbourhoods, livable neighbourhoods, we're using them pretty much interchangeably during this session. Next we have Chantal Spencer. She's a sustainable design student. She's doing an MSc, a disability activist. She lives in Brighton and she is a mobile scooter user. After Chantal, we'll hear from Pearl Owens. She grew up in Hanover and she's now a transport planning consultant in London. And finally, it'll be the turn of Katie Rodder. She's a ward resident with a strong interest in livable neighbourhoods, accessibility and inclusive travel, and independent mobility for children and young people. And she recently completed a master's in transport planning, I think, but she'll tell you. Sorry if I didn't get that right. Okay, so it is great to have a female-only lineup of speakers. It wasn't deliberate. It's quite rare, isn't it, in transport planning? Mannels are much more common in my experience, but we do also have Oliver Stradley in the room too. He's a principal transport planning officer from Brighton and Hove Council, and he's leading on this Liveable Hanover and Tarner pilot scheme. So he'll be ready to take questions at the end, but he won't be speaking now. Okay, so each speaker will have 10 minutes to speak, more or less, and there'll be opportunities to ask questions. I'd like to thank Mark Strong, who you can see on screen. He's kindly offering to sort through questions. If I'm busy speaking, it might be hard for me to do that. So, as you may or may not know, the main aim of a low traffic neighbourhood or livable neighbourhood is to stop motorised traffic, not destined for an area, from cutting through it. So ridding residential roads of this excess traffic can have lots of benefits. The streets should be safer for a start and quieter, making it easier and nicer for people who live and work in the area to walk, exercise, socialise and spend more time outdoors. This should lead to better health outcomes for residents, but it will also help the planet's health too. Obviously a critical need to do all we can to reduce the effects of climate breakdown. And a major way to cut the amount of carbon is to stop burning fossil fuels, which is oil, and reducing the use of petrol and diesel engine cars would help to achieve this. So if we make our infrastructure better for walking, cycling and using wheelchair, as well as for people with sight impairment, and if this infrastructure seems safe, easy and comfortable, people are more likely to want to travel under their own steam. So just to give a bit of a context for anyone who doesn't know very much about what's going on in Hanover and Tarner, the idea of creating a low traffic neighbourhood in the area was brought to the council by local group Hanover Action. I've been kind of the go-between between the council and the Liveable Hanover group, which was born out of the local community groups, including Hanover Action, to represent the people of Hanover. We want the pilot scheme to be co-produced with residents, and we've been trying to find out what kind of scheme they want. We've created a website. We've got volunteer street reps together, and for 2/3 of the street in Hanover. We're still working on Tarner because we've extended the whole project to include Tarner at a later date. And we're working with community groups over there. We've written about the pilot. I've written a few things for the local press. We recently produced a leaflet. Here it is. You might have seen it. And it's got, it had some questions on the back. And it's explaining what the scheme is about and giving people an opportunity to feedback what they'd like to see on their street or in the area. And we've had lots of responses and engagement with that so far, which is good because we do need always to think about the non-digital community and how we reach out to them, and it seems to have gone down pretty well. So roughly half of the pilot scheme will be in the ward that I represent, which is Hanover and Elm Grove, on the Hanover side. And this is to do with where roads are positioned, which I'm sure you'll learn more about later. The other half is in Tarner, which is more on the southern side. It's part of the Queen's Park ward. So it will stretch from Elm Grove in the north to Edward Street in the south. And it will probably be bordered by Queen's Park Road, but consultants will be doing more work on this. So we can't say for sure, because it will have to be whatever's best for the initiatives that we want to introduce. So we've been working to engage community groups and other stakeholders on that side, and having conversations with the councillors over there too. So an important part of the Liveable Neighbourhood pilot scheme is to give people an opportunity to think about how we can improve our streets for disabled people, for children and their parents and carers, and for older people too. So some residents with disabilities are not able to walk or cycle, and we need to ensure their needs are met too, as many will need to drive or be driven. And we need to make sure blue badge holders can drive where they need to within the area and beyond, so that there's adequate parking facilities. So it's my belief that if we get our public space right for the disabled people, the elderly people and children, we get it right for everyone. So the main purpose of today's webinar is to look at how we can do this in a way that makes best use of the space we have and the ways in which we can do it. Please use the comments. If you're welcome to put comments in the box. We can't guarantee we'll see them all. There is a Q&A box if you have questions for the panel. If you have them for specific people, you can say who they're for. The way it's going to work is we're going to start by Brenda Peuch. As I said earlier, she's been working on equality impact assessments for low traffic neighbourhoods in London. She is going to speak, and then you can ask questions for Brenda only to start with. After that, the other three will speak, and there'll be questions for them all. That's because Brenda has another appointment. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Brenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you. It's a real honour. I'd love to have been in Brighton, because I really love Brighton, but I am going down to Brighton on Sunday, so I'll see the sea then. What I'm going to do is just give a bit of context, because London has had a whole plethora of low traffic neighbourhoods, mainly across inner city London, zone 1, zone 2, so sort of, and some in the outer boroughs. And as you all know, it was done suddenly because of the COVID pandemic. So the government actually instructed local authorities to start imposing traffic restrictions to allow people to walk and cycle more easily outdoors, because you needed to avoid indoor social contact. It was about getting people outdoors. And so it was done suddenly, and because so many of them were done suddenly, when anything happens suddenly, whenever you have widespread change, there's always fear of change, there's always resistance, and obviously this happened in London as well, and particularly people who were used to driving. This was a big blow. That they couldn't drive as freely as they could, and many of those affected would have been older and disabled people who drive. So this was obviously this became a big issue, and councils then tried to, or have been trying to sort of find out how they can improve the situation for disabled people and for people across the spectrum, all the protected groups under the Equality Act. So in fact, a lot of them are depending on studies done in low traffic neighborhoods, in older implemented livable neighborhoods or low traffic neighborhoods. So the oldest one in London was in Waltham Forest. It's 3 years old now. So a lot of the studies are based on what happened in Waltham Forest after 3 years, because we've only just started the ones in London. So I'm just going to share my screen and just give you a bit of context. Let me try and do that. Can I share my screen, Elaine, or okay, so I'm sharing. I've got it disabled, so I need it to be enabled.
Okay, how do I do that? Share screen. All panelists. Okay.
Okay. Share. Right. Okay. So now I am screen sharing, and here we go. So I'm just going to give a bit of context. Very recently, the British Medical Journal did an editorial on the impact of motorized transport and how it affects different groups in society. And their conclusion was that vulnerable communities are disproportionately affected by transport-related air pollution, by traffic collisions and injuries, and also ill health due to exercise. So they list out the fact that motor traffic is a major contributor to air pollution, causing tens of thousands of deaths in the UK each year. Noise pollution is also a significant health harm and is associated with increased stroke, premature death. Too much car travel increases, lack of active travel, and is a major cost in terms of physical and mental health. And more people, and then they talk about people who were directly killed by vehicle collisions. And it was in 2019, it was almost 1,800 people, with another 26,000 seriously injured. So we're talking about a major issue and a major problem that we have to deal with that's caused by unrestrained motor traffic use. So, okay, so let's see, yeah. So the studies have also looked at how it affects different groups within the population, and what they find that if you're just looking at road traffic and injury risk, they find that the people who are most affected are people who are deprived, living in deprived, low-income neighbourhoods. And also, if you're from an ethnic minority, you have a much higher risk of being injured in a road collision. In fact, if you add both those characteristics, if you're deprived and from an ethnic minority, then you're over 3 times more likely to be a casualty, to have an injury on Britain's roads, than if you're a white and non-deprived pedestrian. So this is a very recent study. In fact, it was just done a few months ago, that shows that. So it's just, again, showing the impact of motor traffic on groups that are protected under the Equality Act. There have been, so now I'm going to talk about about how the studies conducted on low traffic neighbourhoods in Waltham Forest. And what a recent study shows, only in January this year, shows that within the low traffic neighbourhood, there was a 3-fold decline in injuries compared to the rest of Waltham Forest and the rest of outer London. So walking, cycling and driving all became 3 to 4 times safer. Fortunately, there was no evidence that injury numbers changed on the roads on the boundary or outside the LTM. So it suggests that low traffic neighbourhoods reduce injury risks across all modes inside the neighbourhood and without negative impacts outside it. It also shows that the study, it's the same study, also shows that when you have traffic restriction measures, the impact, and again, this is measured 3 years after implementing it, that people increase their walking and cycling relative to other people, levels of car or van ownership decreased slightly, emergency service response times did not increase, there was a reduction in street crime, quite significant, almost a fifth, and there was a huge reduction in the risk of being injured, 75% reduction in the risk of being injured within the filtered area, so within the traffic restricted area. So there was a lot of positive impact on active travel, injury risk, and street crime. So that shows, you know, the studies that showed they were positive impacts on a huge range of people. But there was another report done, and this was done by a disability charity, Transport for All. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's a national charity. So they did one study specifically for looking at the impact of livable neighborhoods or low traffic neighborhoods on disabled people. So they did a survey, and this was also done quite recently. And they published a report, and it's really worth reading the report. It's called Pave the Way. They had 84 participants, and so this is just an infogram of the number and the type of participants, but I'll go through the results. More than half the participants who responded to the survey of the 84 people owned a car. So I think it was like 60%, but in fact, there's much low car ownership amongst disabled people in London. So there's only, you know, there's in London anyway, car ownership is lower, and it's actually lower amongst disabled people, and it's lower amongst low income groups. So the survey is a good survey, but not entirely reflective of the disabled population or the breakdown of the disabled population in London. So anyway, just to list out what the report listed as the negative impacts on disabled people. So what they said was, there was lack of information. So it led to a lot of confusion and a lot of unhappiness. People who needed to drive had much longer car journeys, and their visitors too. So car travel became exhausting, expensive, complicated, and became very stressful, with an impact on their mental health. Taxi drivers were also more difficult. Journeys were more expensive, and taxi drivers were unwilling to take the roundabout routes. So they were negative impacts. They were positive impacts as well for a number of disabled people. So many of them would say that they had easier or more pleasant journeys, whether they were walking, cycling, or even driving. Again, because they were able to move around walking and cycling, they felt an increase in independence, a decrease in traffic danger, and benefits to their mental and physical health. And a lot of them reported less danger due to traffic. And this was most prominent among deaf and visually impaired participants. What their conclusion was that a lot of them did not like it. They didn't like particularly the people who depended on their cars to drive or as passenger weren't very happy, but they did not want to rip out the traffic restriction measures. And they said that returning to normal was not the solution. Returning to what it was before was not the solution, because what we had before was not accessible enough either. So they've said that the biggest barrier facing disabled people to make active travel journeys, to walk and cycle, is the inaccessibility of the street. And they listed the issues. So obstructed footways, pavements that are too narrow, pavements that are bumpy, uneven, and steep are very difficult for wheelchair users. You could have a lack of dropped curbs at side road junctions, so you can't cross the street. And sometimes the curbs are so high that you can't climb up and down them. There's lack of seating along the route, lack of shelter, so you can't stop and have a rest. Sometimes the layouts are confusing, too many bollards, poor signage, you can't figure out where you're meant to go. Quite often crossings have no tactile warnings, no dropped curbs, and they're often obstructed by signs on the pavement and clutter. So these are the big barriers that disabled people face. One of the interesting, so this was a hand cyclist who said that I can't use my park chair to get around because all the shops have steps. I can't take it with me. so I drive there instead. So it just explains why people sometimes need to drive, because the environment is inaccessible for them. And so they recommend much more engagement and listening to the perspectives of disabled people, and having, along with the traffic restrictions, barriers, having immediate measures and longer term solution to address the many barriers that disabled people face, and encouraging walking, wheeling, cycling, and making sure that the public transport system is accessible and is a viable alternative to car use. So very, very sensible suggestions. So that's suggestions specifically coming from disabled people's groups. And so I'm going to finish with that. And I'm going, yeah, and let me have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda. That was really, really interesting. And it's good. Yeah, I mean, it is different for us now. We can't make those mistakes again. I appreciate that some of the data might have been a little bit skewed because it was more drivers answered than non-drivers, but equally they made
very valid points.
Yeah. So I think we've got no excuse really but to listen. And I know that some of our other speakers will probably be digging down on some of that stuff, particularly Chantal, who's going to speak next. Okay, so we've had a question. If anyone has any more questions, you can put them in the Q&A. I can't answer one of them, but I'm going to see if anyone. These are going to be for you, Brenda, but if anyone else can jump in, that's okay. So, Brenda, if you can't answer a question, because obviously some of them might be very difficult, that's perfectly okay. So the first question was, did you have any information on children, on accidents and children, or incidents that relate to children and young people?
Yeah. From my understanding of all the analysis of road traffic injuries is that it's ethnic minority children, and it's also deprived children who face who have a much larger risk and exposure to road traffic injuries. So that's been proven. I mean, it did need low traffic neighbourhoods to demonstrate that. That's been going on for years and years. It's years and years, about 10, 15, 20 years of research have shown that it's because quite a lot of vulnerable groups live on main roads, and crossing a main road is highly dangerous. And the more independent children are, the more likely they are to be crossing roads and on streets on their own when they're young, and it's a factor of vulnerability. And it's true that children are particularly vulnerable.
Do you have any data on, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot here, but that's really interesting. And I know that I've heard a lot about the air pollution, especially in London.
Yes.
And it was the major factor in the death of Ella Kissi-Debrah, yes. I believe. And obviously that's woken everyone up to the fact that air pollution is a real serious killer, and it's been logged as such. Do you know anything about whether low traffic neighbourhoods are, the roads they're surrounded by, do the pollution levels drop there, or do they stay the same? Is there any data on that?
Well, they actively monitor pollution levels both inside and along main roads, along with traffic counts. So they count the traffic. And well, within the low traffic neighborhood, the pollution levels definitely drop. On main roads, they stay, I think it's shown that they've stayed the same. And over the years, traffic levels overall will drop. Over a few years, traffic levels do drop. And so you'll get back to normal. And yeah,
I've heard that. It sort of dissolves.
It does happen that pollution levels drop overall in areas even around where you have low traffic neighborhoods, because motorists just avoid those areas, and there's a lot of people change their travel behavior. They move around in different ways, and they see, oh well, that it does tend to it's just push and pull. You know, it's a nice area to walk and cycle. So people do that, and that people, you know, are discouraged from driving. And so you get lower pollution overall.
Thanks, Brenda.
Yeah. I'm sure there's studies I can maybe
if they
Mark.
are, I'd love to see them. Yeah.
Study. Yeah.
Brenda, can I just ask one question that's come up in the chat? Was about noise pollution specifically, rather from specifically from motorbikes, but noise pollution as opposed to air pollution.
Yeah.
Is that something that has anyone actually looked at any of that?
Yes. Well, the British Medical Journal, the health professionals have looked specifically at the risk to health from noise pollution, and it causes stress. It causes stress, which can lead to strokes and can lead to heart damage, because stress just leads to those things. You know, any increased stress levels lead to those sorts of illnesses related to the heart and to strokes. And the health professionals have identified that as a significant issue around motor traffic, the noise issues, which, as everyone knows, you know, you are stressed because you can't, if you're outside, you can't talk. And if at night, if you keep your window open, if you're on a main road, it's difficult to sleep. It's you know, it's not surprising that it causes significant stress to the body and the mind.
The person who asked the question was pointing quite specifically, and I can understand why completely, to motorbikes. And obviously the restrictions on cars are the same as on motorbikes, but obviously motorbikes can wheedle their way through sometimes if there is a road that's blocked off. Do you know how that's managed? This is good.
Okay, so the issue around motorbikes and is that they have registration plates. So all power two-wheelers have registration plates. So the trend in London is to have camera enforcement for all the filters, so that, and it's specifically so that emergency services can get through. So and then that's all number plate recognition. It's automatic number plate recognition. So it allows all other vehicles to go through and doesn't allow. And so obviously motorbikes are caught if they go through. So if you just have planters, that's not good enough in terms of preventing private two-wheelers from going through. So that's why automatic number plate recognition is a more acceptable method, and it's becoming cheaper now. And in fact, a lot of boroughs, so I wouldn't say a lot, but I know Southwark has, and Hackney have given exemption to blue badge holding vehicle number plates through those ANPR. Yes, so
I think that's important.
Yeah, so they've done it for blue badge holders and for carers. So it's blue badge. So any number plate that's connected to a carer or to a specific blue badge holder is given exemption. Now, they're not given blanket exemption. You can't go tearing around the whole of the borough because you have a number plate exemption, but you're given it through your area, so through your specific LTN, so you can get out then from your LTN onto the main road, but you cannot enter the other LTNs. You'd be penalised. So once you get out, you have to then stay on the main road. But that has recently been announced in Hackney, and it's been for a long time announced in Southwark boroughs, and I'm sure it's spreading to other London boroughs. So very specific, area-specific exemption, blue badge.
Yeah, we have, and I know they're not legal yet in Brighton and Hove, and I think it's just in Cardiff and in London that they have them. I stand corrected, but if necessary.
Actually, hot off the press.
Introduced at the end of the year.
Elaine, hot off the press news. There was a response to a parliamentary question by Lord Russell Moyle, who's Brighton Kemp Town MP, literally today, confirming that the government was going to introduce the powers in December. So that is, literally today, the government has confirmed it, and there will be advice to local authorities on what to do about it. And authorities will have to apply. It won't be automatic, but authorities will have to apply. But there will be the powers. So I think that's obviously it's up to Elaine, Elaine and her fellow councillors whether to apply.
Well, I think we should, but I think we need to, because I think it will make our LTNs more robust, and yeah, it seems like a good idea. So I'm going to say thank you to Brenda, because I think she does have to go and do her thing.
Yeah, in about 5 minutes.
So we really appreciate you coming along.
Thank you. Appreciate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I'm just going to reply to a few questions in the answer chat. So Elaine, thank you. Yeah.
That's okay. And if we can see your slides and your links at some point,
I am happy to send them to you. Yeah, I can do that.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's move on then. Next we have Chantal Spencer. She lives locally. She's an electric scooter user. So I think I'll hand over and you can take it from there. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. I'll just share my screen. So, okay, so that's not working. Is that working? Ah, okay.
Yes, it's working.
So, hi everybody. Let me try and get this actually going. So, yeah, I'm Chantal Spencer. I'm a designer, a blogger, disability rights activist, and I've lived in Brighton for 21 years now. And I used to be a resident of Hanover, so I know it well. Currently a master's student doing sustainable design at Brighton Uni. And as Elaine said, and is importantly for this conversation, I'm also a disabled woman and a mobility scooter user. So for the last 4 years, I've kind of dedicated all my work and research into disability, and more precisely, I've been sort of researching and looking into isolation within the disabled community, the impact of it, and the causes that lead to it. So a few years ago, if I'd have Googled isolation, this is a sort of fairly typical first page of images that I would have got. For years, many years, obviously isolation within the elderly community is a huge issue, and definitely worth talking about. But sometimes what happens is that the voices of disabled people who also suffer and live with isolation on a day-to-day basis are often not heard or kind of thought about in that context. So the reason why I'm talking about isolation today now is that when I talk about access and accessibility, what I'm really talking about is isolation. And why am I talking about isolation now is because today I Googled isolation, and this is the first screen from Google that I got. You know, it's a very kind of different picture nowadays, and really is a good time to start talking about isolation, as so many of us, in fact all of us, have had a taste of it over the last year and a half. You can see here it's young people looking forlorn out of their windows, and you know, we've all had a taste of what it feels like to have our liberties, our mobility, our favorite thing, our favorite people, our coping mechanisms, and all those things taken away from us. And I think it's really important to frame accessibility issues in this light, and it certainly is for me. As a disabled person, isolation is a big issue for me. Having spent the last 6 days at home from not being well, which is not an unusual event for me. I'm looking forward to tomorrow leaving the house on the 7th day, and hoping that with my reduced amounts of energy that I'll have a good day and a good time and be able to go out. And before I go out, what I do is I plan my route. So I go on Google Maps, because it's all I have really. So I go Google Maps and I go from my door to the door of where I need to go. I walk the whole process and check whether or not there are drop curves along the way, and sort of create my own journey, so to speak, through Google Maps, checking all the time whether or not I'm going to actually be able to get from A to B. And that's pretty much every new journey, or any journey that I haven't taken in a while, because often my routes are kind of strange and back to front. So and not the kind of usual routes that you would take. So here's the map of the new livable neighbourhood scheme and where it is. And I thought I'd do the same process there, as though I was just going for a walk around the whole neighbourhood and see what I would come up with. So what you've got here is all the green dots are drop curbs and all the red dots are not drop curbs. And what you can see is there's quite a lot of drop curbs on the outer edge, but not so many in the middle, and quite a lot along Southover Street. But one of the issues with Southover Street is that obviously we all know, if we've been in Hanover at all, Southover Street and Albion Hill are the hilliest hills since hills began. And you know, somebody in a manual wheelchair would really struggle to get up Southover Street. Even somebody in a power chair and my mobility scooter would probably struggle to get over the top of Southover Street. So having the drop curbs on Southover Street would probably not have been something that a disabled person would have said would have been the right road to put it on. Also, what you can see, there's a lot of roads that have drop curbs at the beginning of a road, not the end of a road. All of this sort of mishmash of drop curbs, not drop curbs, it's not helpful. It doesn't create a space where you can just go. It means that you might be able to get from one place to another, but it would be difficult to know in advance. So here's my lovely friend Lauren. She's been well enough to go out this week and take some footage so we can all have a little look and see what it's actually like for a power chair user in Hanover. So here she is. This is the only way she could tackle this street, because there was drop curbs on one side but not on the other, and there was loads of things in the way, so she couldn't quite get on the street. She thought, I'm just going to go on the pavement, which, you know, it's fine, but we can all understand why that's problematic and not really the best way around it. So here's the video number 2, where she might have decided to go on the side of the road where it's slightly less dangerous, I suppose. And again, some of the big issues with this is that a lot of the roads in Hanover have got a really steep, deep camber, and you can see that her power chair wheels are literally skidding. She's having to use her leg, which again, not everybody can do. I mean, it's just a bit of a disaster. So this is not really how, you know, if I'm being stuck at home for my 6 days, this is not how I want my, you know, my 7th day to go tomorrow. Yeah. So the next one is, a lot of people often say, well, they're only tiny curbs, it's only a little couple of inches, surely you could just bump up. So here's a video of that actually trying to happen on her power chair. You can see her back wheels are skidding. Again, it's the camber of the road. She's at a junction. This is not good. This is putting a lot of pressure on that front wheel. I mean, bear in mind that my mobility scooter cost me £2,500. And as a person who's unemployed and on disability benefits, I'm not inclined to push it to the point where I might break it, because I just don't have the funds to fix it. And a lot of us are in that position. A lot of our mobility aids are our lifelines, and we don't want to break them. And all this stretching and moving and things like that, it's not how it needs to be. You know, it's just not helpful for us. So I overlaid the idea of looking at the drop curbs, and I looked here, and this is basically what the red areas are, what I would consider to be inaccessible areas. They might have a drop curb, but one drop curb, all it takes is for somebody to be parked in front of it, or a bin to be in the way, or some sort of obstruction, and they, you know, Bob's your uncle, you can't go anywhere. So having one drop curb on a road doesn't really make it accessible. Plus, on top of that, it would have been really steep hills, and the yellow areas are still significant accessibility issues, but they are not as bad as the red ones. So when we think about that, and now I've superimposed some pubs on top of it, and I've done this because really living in Hanover and living in that space, in that area, for so many people, and especially for the able-bodied community, is that it's very much about a community, it's very much about space. I could have overlaid the December advent calendar trail, or the days when everybody gets all their stuff out and does the little yard sales and things like that. You know, I could overlay so many things about the community and the community spirit that are inaccessible. If you look at all these pubs, most of them are in the red zone. I know for a fact that a significant amount of them don't have disabled toilets and don't have disabled access. I mean, why would they? There's no drop curb, so nobody can get there. But there's just trying to highlight how important it is to have that physical access. And without that physical access, you can't have that community. You can't have that feeling of community. All you're left with is parties that keep you up all night, really steep hills and high rental costs. So let's look at something positive. What can we do about it? So this is the Central Brighton walking map, or we could call it the drop curb map. And basically this is great. This is a solution for me. I could look at this map and there's so many drop curbs in it. I just would think, right, I can just go to town. I'm not even going to need to look at this map. It'll be fine. Basically everywhere's got a drop curb. I can go there. I can change my plans halfway through the day. I can meet with friends and they can suggest to go somewhere. And I know that as long as I'm kind of within town, I'm going to be all right. And I don't have to sit there and check on Google Maps where I need to go or whatever, you know. And the thing is about these maps is that there aren't any other maps of Brighton like this. There are no other maps that show the drop curbs in other areas, or not that I've found and I've looked. So if there are, then, you know, they need to be more visible for people. But the reason why they're not there is because it doesn't look great. You know, it doesn't look great. There aren't very many drop curbs. As soon as you come out of the kind of busier areas, so it seems to be that disabled people or people in wheelchairs or mobility scooter users like me are expected to sort of, you know, just drive or whatever it is. But, you know, so this kind of thing would be really helpful. This kind of map that really shows up-to-date information about where the drop curbs are, where they aren't. And I think that when we're talking about being a disabled person trying to get somewhere, the amount of planning that has to go into that journey is huge. And especially when you're somebody like me, I have a car and I have access to a car, but I've never really liked relying on a car. I find it much more freeing to be able to get myself places because I don't drive. So being able to go there on my scooter is just like a completely different kettle of fish than being driven somewhere. It feels like freedom. It feels like I'm doing it myself. So what else can we do? And this is where we need to, I really feel really strongly about how we can, these kind of new neighborhoods and this new thinking and these new ideas, and I really wish that we could push them as far as we can. So I know that Hanover, we're talking about community and imagining myself living there and wanting to pop to the shops and not being able to get into the shop because all the shops are tiny and they're really not very well organized for disabled access. But obviously the shop owners are paying a huge amount of rent probably as well, and they need to have as much stock on the floor as possible. So what about if there was a possibility to have this type of thing, like one of those window service hatches, and maybe the shop owners can have a list of goods and list of items and prices online that they always stock, so they don't have to keep updating it all the time, and then you can just pop to the shops and get a pint of milk, which seems like a tiny thing to be able to do. But those are the little things in life that really make you feel like you're independent and you have your life back. Having to rely on somebody to go and get you some cheese from the shop or a chocolate bar or some milk really are some of the things that eat away at your feeling of self. So here is a graph that I've put together today. I've done my best to try and find as accurate information as possible. It's always difficult when you're looking at numbers. But what I really wanted to bring up was the idea of the purple pounds. And we're looking at looking at our community and looking about making community spaces and building an environment that works and is self-sustaining almost, where people don't have to go outside, drive away to go and get the things that they need. And when we're looking at the purple pound, which is the spending power of disabled people in the UK, the current figure is at £274 billion a year. Now that number is insane, and I can never quantify these numbers, so I always need to kind of compare it to other things. So if we look at the number, the sports industry is worth £41 billion, the music industry is £5.2 billion, fashion industry is £26 billion, and the pink pound is £6 billion. So really the purple pound is absolutely smashing all of those, even put together. And when access is limited within these kind of community areas, then where is that purple pound getting spent? That purple pound is getting in its car and it's driving to the local Toby carvery and having a piece of rubbery turkey because they've got a disabled toilet. That purple pound is getting in the car and driving to Tesco's because they've got nice wide accessible areas to go and get their milk and their cheese. You know, that purple pound is being spent on Amazon because, you know, when they're trying to find a present for their best friend's birthday, because they can't go into the shops, or they can't even, you know, they're not welcome in there, you know, and they're not welcome in those shops. So if we look at the top 10 spending categories for disabled households, in the top 6, there are 3 that are basically Brighton and Hove's bread and butter when it comes to economically: food and drink, recreation and culture, and entertainment. And those 3 things are, you know, hugely important Brighton economically wise and things like that. So, you know, it's not just making spaces for disabled people because it's the right thing to do, even though it is the right thing to do, but it's also about thinking about how that could actually impact positively and economically to the whole kind of system, and in a sense make people understand and realize that disability isn't a burden and it's not a dirty word, and that, you know, at the end of the day there are more people disabled around than you'd think, but if we all have to be in our cars driving to Tesco's, then nobody ever sees them. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Chantal. You made some amazingly strong points there. I think we're all kind of just absorbing some of the things that you just said. I mean, the things like being able to just go and get some milk from a shop is just what you would think of as an everyday thing for someone like me, and you can't, you know, having to plan your journeys, not being able to be spontaneous. It's a really, really difficult thing. And I completely see that these are important things that we need to try and address within the low traffic neighbourhood. And yeah, so thank you so much for that. I hope you can hang around for the questions at the end.
Yep. Yeah.
Brilliant.
I was going to ask them, but if you're at the end, I'll say.
Yeah, I think we're going to do them at the end. And if you're going to put questions in the chat, oh, sorry, in the Q&A, not in the chat, can you, Mark is on duty, and if they're for a specific person, it's probably easier to say who that is, just in case we misinterpret it and send you off to the wrong person. Okay, so thank you ever so much for that. And we're going to move it on now to Pearl. So take the floor, Pearl.
Hey, shall I share my screen?
Yes, please do.
Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
So thank you for inviting me to speak. Loved hearing what you had to say, Chantal. That was fascinating. I'm in London right now, but I've been following the Hanover and Tarner livable neighbourhood from afar because I lived in Hanover for 18 years. I grew up on Southampton Street, and I guess the first thing to say is it's a very car-dominated childhood, even though we didn't have a car. Memory of growing up in Hanover is playing out in the street with my brother, or at least trying to. We were unusual in being allowed to play out at all, and I know that because we were normally the only kids out. There's a survey that says that 71% of adults had played out in the street or neighbourhood. So let's say that was in the 70s, compared with only 21% of children 7, so around when we were playing. I want to try and express to you how it felt as kids back then, and I've asked my mum to send me these photos to show you as well. It was very cramped. It was cramped in a house, a lot of energy. It was cramped in the backyard, and it was cramped as well. And this was because of the parked cars. Back then in the noughties, on both sides of Southampton Street, leaving one lane in between for moving traffic. So it's safe to play on the pavement. And because of this, there was a limited amount of games we could play. No tag. We tried to play hide and seek sometimes, but it was very hiding behind the cars, and we kept thinking we were going to get run over. It was very stressful. We couldn't touch the other cars or the other houses. For being told off by a neighbour for drawing with chalk on the pavement outside their house. In fact, I remember another neighbour at my cousin's in Quebec Street didn't like us playing out at all. He complained to my aunt whenever we were outside. He thought we were going to scratch his car. The atmosphere was very tense. The other adults were very stressed out about us being out. And I think the lesson there is it might make everyone, kids and adults, much happier if we change the focus, if we move away from protecting objects and put much more focus on enjoying being together, having fun, watching the kids have fun. Overall, though, it was frustrating. I just want you to imagine that for a minute, you're trying to play and all these adults are on your back, on you. It felt like we had to try really hard to relax in the street, right outside our house. There was no space, the atmosphere was welcoming, there were no other kids out, and it was dangerous. We knew that just the other side of these massive machines, there were more machines that can kill us. So all the way through March, there was an ongoing debate about whether Hanover should have a residence parking zone. Finally, it got one in 2017. I'd already moved out by that point. But when I've been back to Hanover, I can see that there is more space and light on the streets and in basements because there's less parking. That's kind of what I wanted to show with those photos. That the street is kind of feels a lot more open. The problems that we used to have with not being able to get down the streets to put out fires, those problems are much reduced. We have a lot more space to use for whatever we want, and I think that's fantastic. It's not just about play, though, it's about mobility as well. The ability to make autonomous journeys has declined really quite dramatically. So in 19, almost 90% of 8-year-olds went to school without their parents. So by themselves, friends, it was a social activity to walk to school. 20 years later, the figure was just 10%. So when you think about it, that's a really dramatic change that's happened really, really fast. And I don't think we've properly addressed how much of an impact that has had. So why has this happened? There's an author who writes about children in cities called Tim Gill. He says there are two main differences between then and now, in the 70s and now, is the threat of traffic, and secondly, the attitudes of adults, which are of course traffic. He says there's hard evidence that both the speed and traffic leads kids to be outdoors less. Now, it's true that in traffic have been declining over the last few decades, and this is great news. However, this is something of a Pyrrhic victory because it's partly due to the confinement of children. So there are simply fewer children out on the streets available to be killed. Tim Gill says, if you take a sort of historical view, the story of the last century was a battle between children and cars. And in simple terms, they've suffered, well, we've suffered, I would count myself in this, a massive restriction in our ability to move around, play, meet our friends, and participate in the communities that we live in because of high levels of traffic. So I'm not grateful for the livable neighbourhood. I'm so rude. I'm so happy that it's happening now. I just think we should 30 years ago. So we should get a move on. Just quick ideas about what Hanover could do. Firstly, the play at the centre. As I was saying earlier, when we were playing out as kids, it really felt like we were incongruous to the street. Like, we were choosing to play in a car. People would stare at us as they walked past, like, what are these kids doing out here? Even really young, 5, 6, 7, we could tell that the street, it was for cars. And I think it would improve relationships between neighbours if we turned the focus of the streets around 180 degrees and cars as guests, and children's play as a positive, inevitable feature of the streets. Secondly, the zone opened up a lot more space from the roads, but it wasn't very inventive in how it, and that's fine, but this is what the Liveable Neighbourhood is for. The Liveable Neighbourhood is an opportunity, and for your kids to be creative. How do you want to use all this that we've got? This one on screen is actually a permanent play street in Hack. It took a lot of work. You don't need to go this far, but it's just some ideas. So the paint on the ground, and in this one is really, really cheap and easy. They've got a little heart made of sticks there, boulders, some low walls, which can be used as benches or for walking along. And I was thinking maybe there's some kind of like play equipment or art concept that would slant of the hills in quite an interesting way. There's a lot of options that are open to you in Hanover, which I think are really exciting. And finally, I've seen a lane that you're consulting directly with kids in schools, and I think that's fantastic. That they'll have some really, really great ideas, and they're usually enthusiastic about. You put this one up, which I've nicked because I just love it. It's this girl, I don't know, Sienna, I think, and she's got her ideal benches, sand pits, dog mess bins, rosemary bed, lavender bed, grass instead of paving. I think these are some great ideas. So I think you should definitely keep consulting with children, and I'll leave it there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pearl. That's great. And it's good that you put that on the end. I just double checking you got her name right, but it was. So yeah, I loved Sienna's picture. But yes, I mean, almost some of those things that you just showed us brought some of that stuff to life, what we were seeing in London. And I think, yeah, you probably had your childhood, sadly, but at least we're going in the other direction, at the worst time for playing out. You soldiered on and you tried, and you were considered the weird one for wanting to do that, but of course children want to play. And yeah, the quotes that you said from, was it Tim Gill?
Tim Gill, yeah.
Yeah, machines, you know, winning the battle over children. I mean, yeah, it kind of nails it. So thank you so much for your comments, and it really does give a perspective, you know, that, to see which direction I think we really need to go in. So thank you. And if you can, are you okay hanging around for the questions at the end? That'd be great. So thank you. We're going to move on now to our final speaker, Katie Rodder, and she has a lot of interest. I'll let her get on and start.
I'll just try and share my screen. So can everybody see that now? Can you all see that now? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Cool. Okay, I'll make a start. Just wanted to share some research that we heard today actually at a webinar from Manchester, which was very interesting, about opposition to LTNs actually. And that was, they have discovered in Manchester a lot of the opposition was actually from people walking, not from people driving, because they thought it was all for cyclists. So we're going to try and work really hard in Hanover because it's not all for cyclists at all, because we know how hilly it is. So I just thought I'd share that. So I'm talking about accessible, social and inclusive streets. If I can change my screen, and this is going to be interesting because my keyboard's going to sleep. There we go. Okay, next one down. Hang on, sorry, not changing screen. Ah, yes, okay. So a people-friendly neighbourhood doesn't just happen by reducing traffic volume. As you can see, we have a motorway empty here, but of course we aren't getting rid of the cars, and you will still be able to get everywhere that you can get to at the moment. You might have to take a slightly different route, but we already have a number of one-way streets. It's called traffic management really, and it'll just be a little bit more traffic management. You may not even notice it in some places because we have quite a lot already in the North Lane and around the station area. So it'll just be a little bit more traffic management. So oopsie, wrong one, there we go. So yes, so really what I wanted to come back to is sort of touching on, sort of repeating a few things, well, hopefully not repeating too much what Chantal was talking about the details. So what we have here is two pictures really, which are showing some issues on pavement widths. So I've researched a little bit about this, and as far as I can find out, there's actually no legal minimum width for footways, but there are some very strong guidances. So we're going to try and work to those guidances really in Hanover if we possibly can. There's a very good book, bit of guidance called Inclusive Design Guidance for Getting Outdoors, and that's a good one to read. So it's at the end of the presentation, there's a list of references. So I mean, like everybody else really, walking with children and walking with large bags and everything else, I'm absolutely infuriated when a pavement is too narrow for me to pass someone going in the other direction, because you know, motor traffic isn't often convenienced like this right outside the door every single step of the way. It's also came as a surprise to me. I think some people have mentioned the bins, so I'm going to do the unmentionable, mention the bins. That Brighton Hove does have some rules around bins, which is that properties shouldn't have wheelie bins if residents can't store them off pavements without having to haul them up or down 5 steps. But I think this guidance came in after everyone already had the wheelie bins. So that's a bit of a shame, but we'll work on the wheelie bins. So here's another kind of width as well, which we haven't really touched on so much, and this is crossing widths. There's going to be a limited amount of work we can do on this, because I don't think the Liveable neighbourhood is going to be moving very many curbs. The one below is actually an excessive one. That's in Prestonville. It's not in Hanover at all. I just put it in there because you can see along that yellow dotted line just how far that road junction spreads. It's about, I don't know, 20 or 30 or 40 yards. It's absolutely enormous. So the spare space here has been made into road space, which is really unnecessary for traffic. If you ever see traffic lines after it's snowed, you can always see how much turning space they need and how much they don't need. And in a walkable friendly space, we'd try to give the spare space to people. And we'll get some ideas as we go along. And I've included the top one with Elm Grove Junction because I'd love to redesign that junction actually. At the moment it's been designed on the turning circle of a B-52 bomber really, so we can do a little bit better hopefully. So another one which Chantal mentioned is curbs here. So curbs are a huge obstruction. We don't need, I mean, Chantal's already said this. Having said this, it's an area of conflict actually, because blind and visually impaired people quite like curbs because they use them to navigate. So we have to work with people, and tactile paving is obviously a really good answer. So we don't want to turn one person's solution into somebody else's problem. What I would say as well is that even better than talking about drop curbs and all that kind of thing is actually talk about continuous footways, which is a bit of a technical term. It's when you, instead of dropping down the pavement down to the road level to cross over, you actually raise up the road level, so it becomes like a little speed bump at the edge of every junction. And that means that people using the footways sort of automatically get cars slowing down as they come towards them, and you're not dropping down at all. So you miss out on all the nasty cambers and things that arrive when you put dropped curbs in. So talking about cambers, that's a street here with a massive camber. We can't fix all these cambers, but what we can do is to work out where they are and try and work out their impacts by working with people who are affected by them. And then we can look at other places for putting, for instance, nice seating areas or whatever it is you want to do, and imply better routes throughout the district. So instead of saying, oh, look, this is the biggest road, this is Grove Street, which is nice and wide, instead of saying, oh, this is the natural one to use for X, Y, and Z, we might say, well, it's not, because it's got an absolutely shocking camber on it. So we can look at the details. So the next one is gradient. There's obviously little we can do about the gradient as well. But again, we can recognise it and put the preferred routes elsewhere, so we can try and traverse the hills rather than going straight up. And I think probably lots of us do that if we're walking, if we're riding a bike with shopping on, but working out where those routes should be and not just assuming people can go straight up the hills. I think that's something that really comes from a sort of the car thinking actually, is that hills don't matter. And this is a slightly separate one, like the corners as well. So these corners here are quite blind, and they're quite tight as well. So when we're designing streets for people, this kind of comes into the next one as well, really. We'd like a bit more space around corners if we can, so that people can turn safely, don't suddenly crash into people at the side, can see around the corner more easily, that kind of thing. We can't always move curbs. I don't know if anyone might have seen down on the bottom of Sutherland Road, the corners there have been widened, and it's much nicer now. They've reduced the crossing distance and put nice wide corners in. And the last detail I think I'm coming to, I think it's my last one, is about sight lines. And this is really important for children playing and for everybody using the streets. And this is a network road here, or a boundary road. This is Queen's Park Road. this kind of crossing is really awful. There aren't that many crossings on Queen's Park Road. There's only one signal crossing between Egmont Place and Queen's Park and Elm Grove. The rest of them are all these refuges, if you're lucky. And now it's quite hard to see in this picture, but where the silver car is, just above the yellow circle, there's quite often vans parked there, or high-sided vehicles. And if you're a young person, even adults actually can't see past those, but young people can't even see past those cars. They just can't see over the tops of them. And you can't see if the space is safe to go into till you're actually in the space. So reducing the sort of issues around sightlines is really important for making somewhere livable, because if you're an elderly person, you can't walk backwards quickly. If you're in a mobility scooter or something which is helping you get along that you can't reverse so quickly, then a sightline like that is just really scary, because I mean, I wouldn't let my children cross there at the moment. I just find it far too scary, even now. So I think this comes onto another issue as well, which is around the edge of the LTN. We know that some of the problems are with severance and getting to other areas. We don't want to create a ghetto. We want to create a place that's easy to use. I think one of the questions in the chat was about creating sort of reaching into other areas. And we really want to be able to make it easy for people to walk and cycle through Hanover, even if they don't live there, because they're going to be walking through, and it's going to be a nice environment, and they'll be able to benefit from being nearby, even if they haven't had an LTN straight away themselves. It'll be a nicer place for them to do those things. So this slide here is sort of, I've got a sort of slightly incongruous picture really, because I've got a picture of a very nice little parklet. It's the curb actually comes up to decking, so it's nice and flat. But I've put it about recognising and addressing obstructions. So livable streets need features adding to them, things that make human speed rewarding and engaging, so that you can move through the streets, really enjoy your journeys. And I've said here actually, our streets can learn quite a lot from certain tourist attractions, such as gardens and outdoor parks, so places you enjoy being, but actually really near your home. And if this sounds a bit strange, I think we'll just have a little think about the opposite of this. So the opposite would be no trees. You have large plain-sided buildings that take several minutes to walk past, many cars or vans blocking you from seeing the street, or from anyone on the street, or from seeing you, or pavement adjacent to several lanes of fast-moving traffic. There's nowhere to sit if you tire. There's no safe crossings, or very large crossings that might not be realistic for slower walkers. I did discover a couple of years ago that I think it's 2/3 of pedestrian crossings in London are actually, the signals are too fast for elderly people. And there's no cafes or outlets or anything of interest for your senses. There's nothing there. It's just a somewhere that's not nice to walk. So nobody really likes walking in places like this. So when we're trying to make our streets more livable, we're quite lucky in Hanover. The houses are very small, so it means that the view is always changing as we walk. But we need to work a little bit harder. We can't just take the traffic out or reduce the traffic and expect it to work. We've got to do a little bit more like that. So this one here, I've put a few details for climate safe and sociable streets. We're seeing climate resilience taking a bit of a front page this week in the northwest of America with the brutal hot weather. And we know from a lot of research that getting trees into streets is really important for bringing temperatures down in the summer, and also for other climate reasons as well. So for instance, Queen's Park Road, and we really got one tree between Elm Grove and Egmont Place, so we'd like a few more trees up there. So these things are really important, but the picture I've shown there, as you can see, it's got cobbles in front, so we need to make them accessible. So cobbles are really horrible if you're sitting down to get around on a scooter or something with small wheels. So I think what I've said here about this Places to Perch, the reason we like those is you might just stop to tie a shoelace or take a stone out of your shoe. You might adjust your shopping bag. Somebody else might have a coffee or make a phone call, and children will come along and they might roll their toy cars along the flat topped walls, or even balance on them as well. So they're all things that will help to make a journey that you're walking a little bit more enjoyable. And if you're walking slowly because you can't walk very far, you don't have to walk very far because you can sit down somewhere. And we've got the safe sight lines and the slow speeds as well. So here's just another example really of a seating area. I've put this in because it's actually quite a nice design. I'm not sure how useful it is because it's top of a massive hill, but once you get there, there is somewhere to sit down and look at the nice view. And the interesting thing about this as well, I think this is also very important for a livable neighbourhood. This is free to do this here. You're not charged for sitting down here. So we call this sort of non-transactional space, and it's really important. I compare it to Canary Wharf, where I went once for a part of my studies. In Canary Wharf, there is no public seating at all. You have to buy coffee if you want to sit down anywhere. So that's not inclusive because it's excluding people just from resting when they need to. The other thing I'll mention as well, which Chantal spoke about actually in a lot more detail and a lot more useful detail, but having the local shops here is very important. And it's part of having a useful low traffic neighbourhood is proximity. So we haven't really talked about the 20-minute neighbourhood at all, or 15-minute city, but they're all sort of similar things really. It's where not only are we creating a space which people can walk around, but actually they can get useful things in that short time as well. So you don't need necessarily to go very far to get useful things. And we're very lucky here. We've got the pharmacy and the surgery, there's meeting places, and there's small essentials. Having said this, as Chantal has noted, we need to make them accessible as well. And the last, I think pretty much nearly the last slide, we need to talk about conflict. So where things aren't working, we really need to talk about them and to try and get them right. So I've mentioned curbs before, and I think it's really important to involve people in the solutions. So for instance, tactile paving, when you don't need to, where you want to take a curb out, but make it accessible for people with impaired sight. So there are solutions, but you need to talk about them. And look at them creatively, which is always difficult. I think also recognising that the stakeholders of the street as well. So that the streets do have lots of different stakeholders. You've got businesses, you've got shops. Some streets have schools on, of course, and they have. I mean, Carlton Hill's got a big school community there, and Elm Grove does as well. So remember all the stakeholders when we're talking about doing things with people. Some of them are very silent. They're not able to vote or anything either. So what I'm hoping is that we're beginning to see our streets a bit differently here, and do some relationship building with the most immediate environment. So not just with each other, but with our environment too. The image on the right there is by a man called Carl Gilg, and if we're using our local streets like this, there's something wrong, and I think we need to make it better. So we've got some tools to use for people who want to go and do some sort of extra work or little bits on their own street. The Healthy Streets Check is really good. It's got sort of indicators which you can use to check how useful your street is and how accessible. And yes, I've just said engage as well. Don't wait for people to be impacted negatively. Include people in processes and not just in the end design. And there's some information which I think will be available afterwards. I'll stop there.
Thank you ever so much, Katie. So much in there, so much in there. You're going to share these afterwards. Is that okay? Yeah, same with everybody. I was just very pithy. So much to take in. And I haven't seen that, the Healthy Street Check. First time I've seen it. I think that's quite a nice way of looking at it, the health of your street. It's good. And I like that little comment that's standing out is Queen's Park Road Junction being like the turning circle of a B-52 bomber. I can see completely what you're saying there. So thank you ever so much for all of that. Lots of food for thought from you and from all the others. I'm going to hand over to Mark now because he's been collating questions. Now we only really have 15 minutes. I'm happy to go over if other people are, but we'll see how far we get. And at past we can check back in on it. Okay. And we also have
thanks, Elaine,
available to answer the questions.
Yeah, I think there's a couple that sort of I think are about technical issues, and I think Oliver certainly would want to answer that, but I think also Chantal's experience, because we know about street bins, and let's face it, it is an issue, and all sorts of obstructions, planters, street bins, and indeed bikes stuck on lampposts are all obstructions for visually impaired people, wheelchair users, and indeed just people who are trying to get past. So I was wondering, Chantal, if you wanted to say something about those issues, but also Oliver, how you might think about how we would address those concerns about street furniture and clutter.
Yeah, absolutely. Those, I mean, they are a never-ending burden to get around, really. Constantly kind of moving things around, especially at the moment, because everybody seems to be revamping their house, so there's all sorts of ton sacks outside of things, outside of people's houses, and on recycling, and yeah, bikes locked up. And what it does is the impact isn't just an irritation and annoyance. It's more than that. It really makes you feel like nobody cares. It makes you feel like you go home despondent. You can't go and see the person that you wanted to go and see. If you think that a lot of people that are on mobility scooters or wheelchairs or power chairs have limited amounts of energy and time that they can dedicate to moving from A to B. And if suddenly that journey is extended, then, you know, often we just have to turn back and go home, you know. And the amount of things that are on the path is extremely frustrating, you know. It feels like it's almost a pipe dream to expect people to put their bins away and their recycling away and their bicycles away. It seems to be that actually we need to kind of be more practical about that. I think people don't put their bikes away, people don't put their bins away, people don't put their recycling away. Let's actually deal with the reality of the situation rather than keep saying that it's somebody else's fault that they should do that about it when they're not going to, they never have, you know. So yeah, that's kind of my take.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chantal. And yeah, in terms of the audits you've already been doing across the area, that's very much part of an initial stage of understanding where the existing obstructions are more generally, you know, going forward. So that audit that you've conducted so far can be augmented, reinforced by the work that we're lining up with possibility people, the local sort of pan disability representative group, and we'll broaden that to, I mean, the work you've already done is brilliant, it really is. And what you noted about the drop curbs, I mean, it was much worse. I mean, it's still not good enough by a long stretch, but across the whole city, one of my colleagues, one of our colleagues in the transport planning team, he's been working, a guy called Keith Fowler, he's been working really hard, making sure he's been getting every little bit of money he can find from all manner of potential sources. And he's been doing it for a number of years, putting in drop curbs and making sure that you're starting to get these networks. It just never existed before, and it's big credit to him. And in terms of the map that's been produced for that, I think I don't have it to hand today, but I will follow this up afterwards, and we should be able to show you what it was like across the city and compared to what it is now, and yeah, in terms of where we want it to be. And that is hopefully a piece of work that comes out, and you know, when we get to a stage where we've got a proper policy strategy for understanding the approach to other requests, responding to other requests about possible livable neighbourhoods across the city, that will be well placed with a sort of forward-thinking framework which has that sort of understanding about the eligibility and the feasibility of delivering any livable neighbourhood across the city. But yeah, just looking forward to making it better for people generally. That's everyone included. So yeah.
Thanks, Oliver. And I think that was a really good question. And Chantal, you brought some, really important points. I'm going to go back to Mark because I think he has.
Yeah. So let's stick with the awkward questions, because and Katie wanted to answer this, I know, but also Pearl might want to respond. There is an issue about, or perception maybe, of the issue about what happens to traffic. Boundary roads are a particular issue. The roads around the outside. Or one-way streets, the way to do it, what are the implications for utility, and it isn't mentioned, but emergency services as well. All these are really valid concerns, and particularly in London, they've all been looked at already. So at least we're not sort of completely without precedent. But I think it would be good to hear maybe from Pearl and Katie about some issues, and then again from Oliver maybe about how they've been, how we might look at it locally. Either of you go first. Pearl, okay. Pearl maybe.
Sure. So yeah, because we've, as Brenda said, had so many it's implemented in such a short space of time, there's a lot more data available than even 2-3 years ago on the impact of how these type of filtering schemes work, even the temporary ones. And the vast majority of that data says that traffic evaporates, it's not displaced. So there's a kind of like orthodoxy that traffic is like water. The more space you have, the more it kind of disperses across the space. If you have a low tray full of water, then the water would be much lower, wider tray, if you have more road space. But I've coming to see in the last decade or two, that's not actually how traffic works. If you make it easy to drive, then people will drive. So what has happened in low traffic that we've had in London is they do monitoring before and after. So they put traffic counts along roads and inside the low traffic neighbourhoods. And what they see is that traffic reduces. On the boundary roads, initially, it goes up a bit because it's a new thing. It's not on Google Maps yet. People don't quite know what's going on. But then overall, even goes down. And that's what we've seen in Lambeth, in Southwark. And that's because people drive less, change the way they get around based on how the roads are easier to walk. If it's easier to cycle, then they're more likely to choose those options. Additionally, I think not all roads are the same. Some of them are residential and some of them actually are A roads, B roads. And that's why you've chosen Edward Street, possibly Queen's Park Road, is because they are bigger roads. They're designed for more traffic. And it's kind of an accident that all this traffic has even come to areas in the first place. So, because the roads aren't designed for it, as we've seen, they have parking sides, they're not designed for big vehicles. So really, it's just resetting the neighbourhood to how it should be, with a lot less traffic and a lot less rat running.
I just wanted to add to that, actually. Some of the people who were early on, I think they're less worried now, but people up in the Pankhurst area are a little bit worried about displaced traffic. Town Terrace is already quite a rat run, and Pankhurst as well. And I think it's very interesting for them, because if we can stop rat running through Hanover, people won't really be able to access Down Terrace and Pankhurst in the same way, because they come through Hanover to get there. And if you're going around the outside already, you're on Elm Grove or you're on Edward Street or wherever it is, you won't be coming out of Hanover right opposite Down Terrace and Pankhurst. That route will be sort of stopped, if you like. So I think there should, it is all down to traffic movements, which I know Oliver and the team will be looking at really closely, to stop any bad knock-ons happening. But it doesn't necessarily happen that just because this traffic goes from one area, it suddenly fills up another, because people are following a route, they're following a plan, and in fact, and if you think how you get somewhere, you don't sort of suddenly go back to an old rat run, which is now very hard to get to, cut off. Yeah, I live on Queen's Park Road, and in fact I'm very, very keen on this idea, because Queen's Park Road, as far as I can see, most of the time is actually very under capacity. So if we do get a bit more traffic on Queen's Park Road, it is not going to be a disaster. The road is designed for it, and if it keeps it out of Hanover and it does its job, then that's fine. And eventually more people will find Hanover easier to travel through, and hopefully won't be driving anywhere.
Thank you very much, Kate. Yeah. Oliver, are you going to jump in there?
I was only going to say something you've said before, around the issues we have with Google and Waze not only sending traffic through residential areas, but also not updating their base maps and causing current issues with people getting sort of snagged up in bus gates or whatever and being fined. There are issues that currently are experienced, and we can help resolve those by making a low traffic neighbourhood going forward.
How long does it take for the data from like a low traffic neighbourhood goes in? How quickly do the sat-nav companies catch on? Does anyone know?
It depends on mistakes people make. So if people start avoiding it, and if people again, but you can also report. As a resident, it just takes like people to say to Google, there's a filter here, you can't drive through. So maybe that's, if there's anyone who's particularly keen, you could do that when the neighbourhood
I'm going to do that. Good idea. Thank you. I think, Mark, thank you very much for that, guys. That is wonderful. I'm just wondering if we could have one last salient question. Have you got one there, Mark? We can't hear you right now.
Sorry, one question for you, actually, really, because I think this is the most salient question from the political leadership of the council, is what's the timescale and the budget for the Liveable Neighbourhood project? And the other question, actually, that's interesting is, and you did refer to it, it's a pilot, but I think there's a concern that, you know, there are areas which have greater deprivation or greater challenges than Hanover. You know, it is a reasonably, there are problems, but it's a reasonably active area compared to other areas in the city. So what will happen to other areas that have more other needs, other deprivation needs? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Is this for me or is it for Oliver? I'll answer and he'll probably put me right afterwards. Okay, so I think we are about to appoint the consultants, and once they're in place, we will start the consultation process. We will feed in all the stuff we've been doing, which is why it's been really important to get this kind of grassroots engagement happening beforehand. So it informs the way in which they look at the scheme and see how, you know, the reactions of people, of local people, and what they want and what they're thinking about. That's why events like this are really important. I mean, I've got a list that is a few months old, which Oliver might want to update. In August, the options are being costed and prepared, and then, sorry, the surveying was supposed to happen during the summer. Is that right? And then towards the end of the summer, we will look at the different possible options based on what, because we will have a consultation, a proper consultation that will go out to people looking at different streets, where they live and what they'd like to see done. So we've been priming for this, really. The consultant will be experienced in looking at, hopefully, the type of scheme that we're going to put in, what can be done, what might not be able to be done now. We don't have a huge budget. From my memory, I think it's 250,000. So we'll mostly be about planters and rerouting and things like that. Initially, I think we can put more money into it and it can evolve. But initially, there is a huge pot. It's, in terms of it being a pilot, I think it's because we are doing a lot of consulting, but we want to be open to the fact that things might not be put in the right place. They might cause something else. As we say, I think it was Katie who said it, you can cause solving one problem can cause another. We would, you know, prepare for the things that might come up, but we might not always do that. And so, yeah, then the experimental traffic orders will go in and they'll be put in place. Is after 6 months, things can be removed if they're really causing a problem, but really we try and let it run for between 12 and 18 months. And your next question was about whether there's the political will to do this across the city. Is that right?
Well, in other areas, this is a pilot. There are areas with worse deprivation, and how, you know, will we be looking at those sort of issues as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is it. We will only be, I think having Tarner in the picture gives us a wider kind of framework of what we're looking at. Two different types of housing, one predominantly social housing or built in that way, and the other the kind of sort of traditional two up, two down, just going straight out onto the pavement. Yeah, I mean, as far as this is my dream, is that we'll do this so well that we'll almost be able to cut and paste it across the city, and we'll learn from it, we'll reflect on the way we do it, we'll look at, you know, how it evolves and take it from there. But I do personally imagine that it will be part of something much, much bigger, but I can't say that 100% because we do have to have the political will from other parties as well for that to happen. And I think maybe Oliver might want to correct me on a few things, I don't know.
No, not really, but there will be a degree of needing to work with synchronicity across more than one budget that's coming into play. So the sort of complementary measures. The total budget initially is £300,000 for the pilot LTN. That would include the first round of measures, the introduction. If once the option's been developed, if we require further LTP, local transport plan funding, potentially in the second year, there might be, but that'll be subject to the administration allocating that funding. and the other budgets that are potentially going to help deliver complementary budgets that the city has much needed. We've sort of been touched upon by Katie that we need more trees. There's money for trees. I think it's 150,000, I think, for trees. I might be wrong on that. And there's also money for bike hangers, again, citywide, and pocket parks, 150k for pocket parks across the city, which could potentially be parklets. I think it's reasonable to extend the scope. Pocket parks being maybe underused space within footway areas, public realm, and parklets being parking bays that are either temporary, on a temporary basis, or permanently are become parklets that might itself have a tree in, or lighting, or seating, or other sort of infrastructure that's useful for community use going forward. And in terms of what we're doing in parallel, as required by the last ETS committee recommendations in March, relevant to this particular project, is that we do need to develop a framework, which I sort of alluded to earlier on, which will include a eligibility framework for assessing requests that would be based on joint strategic needs data, which includes the sorts of insight that has been spoken of earlier on, in terms of indices of deprivation, the number of accidents in a particular super output area, or all these technical terms on those, but there will be a full framework for assessing, evaluating any requests, and then feasibility, which will be done a matter of assessing, creating a study on the area and understanding, for example, drop curbs and so on, and what we can do in any first phase of works with the money we have at that time.
Thanks, Oliver. Yeah, you filled in quite a few of the gaps. So I'd forgotten about the fact that we had put that extra work in to look at the possibility of using what we do to inform how we build them across the city, and we need a strategy as to how we make that decision. So thank you. I think we'll probably wrap up there. I want to say a really big thank you to all our guests, and I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone for coming, because it is getting a bit late, and most of you are still in the room. I can share around if anyone wants. I'm going to put it in. I don't know how to get into the chat bit, but we have the chat I'm seeing is just for the panelists. Can I do one that's for everybody? I don't know if I can. We have an email address, which is liveablehanover@gmail.com. If someone could put that in the chat, that would be good. And if anyone wants to see the slides, I'm going to create a blog based on what we did today, to summarize what was said, because there was a lot came out of it today. So thank you. The other thing I was going to say was that Pearl alluded to it earlier, that the picture by Sienna with the My Dream Street. I actually created a lesson plan based on an idea that was from the group that we are the Liveable Hanover group, where we got people to put posters of how they'd like their street to be in their window. And I just took that, and there were lots of people took part, and I know the people in this room that took part, and there was some great responses. And then basically I just kind of took that idea about how we could translate it into a lesson in a school, thinking about the possibility, and then them creating their own posters. So I've got posters from St Luke's, from Elm Grove School, and from Carlton Hill. And so what I did was I got in touch with Jubilee Library and asked them if we could exhibit them, and they said yes. So that's great. So we're going to have that on display at the library between the 13th and the 26th of IDEA. And please come along, you'll see some lovely, very imaginative examples of accessible, green, and really good fun streets. And I do think it is nice just to throw out there the possibility, and from there we can work backwards and create the street that Pearl should have had in her childhood, I think. That would be lovely. So a big thanks to everyone for coming. You can also find us on hanoverandgrove.net. There's the Liveable Neighbourhood page within that. And I'm sorry for not putting it in the chat. I just can't work out how to, so I'm very sorry. But if you send us an email, we'll be able to direct you to that. And we have a mailing list if anyone wants to join that. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And oh yeah, we will keep you posted if you want to be. And I hope you've enjoyed today's little presentation. Thank you. Goodbye and have a good evening.